Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. So my name is Miriam Tola, and I'm a faculty member at JCU. And on behalf of the Communication and Media Studies Department at JCU, I welcome everyone. And this is the third talk in the Digital Delights and Disturbances speaking series. This event is also co-sponsored by the Gender Studies minor. We are quite happy about that. And I would like to acknowledge also our collaborators and partners before actually introducing our speaker for today. So I would like to acknowledge our collaborators, particularly CREAT, the Inter-University Research Center on Transnational Technocultures, pretty long name, and Narrow Magazine. Narrow Magazine published yesterday a great interview with our speaker, Dr. Francesca Sobande. I would invite all of you to check out this interview. So I am thrilled to introduce Francesca Sobande. Thank you for being here with us. Francesca Sobande is reader in digital media studies at Cardiff University in Wales. Her work, very eclectic, has some of our students here had the chance to find out yesterday, at least in my courses. Her work explores range of different topics, including gender and race in digital culture, remix culture and music, Black archives, and Black feminist perspectives on popular culture. Dr. Sobande is a very prolific scholar and activist, and I'm just going to mention some of her most recent books. The new book that was published in 2024 is titled Big Brands Are Watching You, Marketing Social Justice and Digital Culture, published in 2024. Dr. Sobande is also the co-author of the Anti-Racist Media Manifesto, also published in 2024. Francesca will present for about 35 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A, and you're all invited to stay for the Q&A and just pose questions. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. And I just would like also to remind everyone the next appointments for the DDD speaking series on November 21st. We will have a performance artist from Lebanon, Aig Aviazan. And on November 21st, we will have Tiziana Terranova from the University L'Orientale of Naples. So please join me in welcoming Francesca Sobande. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I just want to start by saying thank you very much for this generous invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to getting the opportunity to hopefully speak with some of you today. I feel strongly about opening what I'm sharing by telling you a little bit about the place from which I write and the place from which I work. And that really means telling you a little bit about who I am. So before I speak more about the specifics of Black digital currents and digital delights and disturbances, I wanted to share a bit about a project that has really stemmed from collaborative work with a dear friend, an independent writer and curator and organizer, Layla-Roxanne Hill. And this work really connects to who each of us is, and also some of the shared experiences or just conversations that we've had over the years. As you might already be able to tell, potentially from my accent, I've spent most of my life in Scotland, although I haven't lived there for now around about 8 or 9 years. My hometown's Edinburgh, and that's meant that along the way, as part of the work that I do as a writer, as a researcher, I have turned my attention to being Black Oot Here in Scotland. And this involved eventually working on a book with Layla-Roxanne Hill, Black Oot Here, Black Lives in Scotland. but also thinking more about different ways of sharing and expressing some of our thoughts on what it means to be Black in Scotland, and some of our thoughts on Black Scottish history and Black history in Scotland, the nuanced similarities and differences between being Black and Scottish and being a Black person in Scotland, really trying to sort of grapple with the specific ways that living as a Black person at a regional, a national level, and within a nation that's part of the UK, but is very contested at times in terms of its dynamics with regards to England and Scotland. Some of the specifics of how we then take care with our use of language. We then take care with the sorts of labels or terms that are ascribed to people and are used to discuss history. And when we started to think about how else we wanted to share our work, we found ourselves reflecting on children. This meant, how could we potentially try and communicate some of what we'd been looking at to do with being Black Oot Here, going beyond that sort of framework of a monograph? And I love writing. I'd say that writing is one of the things that is at the core of not only my life, but it's a part of who I am. There's never a moment when I'm writing where I'm not rubbing my temples and sort of thinking, why do I choose to do this? But fundamentally, it's something that I love. That said, we recognize that not everybody wants to or is able to engage with ideas through the context of a monograph. And we're also very aware of the fact that some of the ways that ideas are conceptualized or discussed with the use of certain terms, academic phrasing, it can result sometimes in forms of communicating that actually are quite exclusionary and are quite sort of insular, and that's the last thing we wanted to be doing. So all of that's to say, we ended up working on a co-created graphic novel alongside a wonderful illustrator, Chris Manson, and with two people who translated that in Scots, Leslie Benzie, and Scottish Gaelic by Naomi Gissesi. And we wanted this graphic novel to be something that children could hopefully enjoy. We wanted this graphic novel to really focus on the visual side of things. We wanted it to feel playful. And we then started to think about how else this could be brought to life, which led to us working on this animation that I'm going to share. And the animation was created by Leeds Animation Workshop, who are a fantastic feminist collective that have been doing this work for many years, for decades. So if you're not familiar with them, I'd encourage you to check them out. And all of that is to say, before I start to discuss Black digital currents, even though we don't think of this as being a digital project, digital technology is at the heart of how we were able to do any of this work. All those people I just named, the majority of the time that we worked together, we worked in asynchronous and remote ways. I don't think we've ever all been in the same space physically at the same time. So for me, this is one of the delightful sides of making use of digital culture and digital media to think about the specifics of being Black in Scotland, and to also think about, in particular, with this animation, the graphic novel, what it might mean to be a Black girl in Scotland faced with a question around doing a project on Scottish history. So I'll share that now, and then I'll speak a bit more about Black digital currents. you. So just sort of briefly before I segue into speaking more about Black digital currents, I also wanted to add that the music there, which was new music commissioned and created by, we commissioned Nathan Somevi, who created that music, and it was partly because we wanted to also share our work in a way that went beyond spoken word. And with this particular project, we were thinking a lot about dreaming. So what it means to dream as a Black person. The story of Ola, who is the girl depicted in the graphic novel, and the animation is a fictional story. But in the animation, some of the images you saw towards the end from that box of photographs are based on photographs of our own. So they're photos of friends, family, loved ones. And this meant that we were thinking quite a lot with work such as that of Stuart Hall and Living Archives, Black Archives, and how we can try and work with creative methods to, contribute to the ways that Black Scottish history is archived and documented, but also in ways that are hopefully intergenerational and not just by adults and for adults. So to think now a little bit more about currents, I'm going to share a bit about what this project has developed into. And I suppose I feel that with anything that I'm involved in, it's always ongoing. With any thought I have, with any piece of writing, it's never a full stop. I know that when we're dealing with studying, when we're dealing with universities, when we're dealing with academia, we also often speak about, a conclusion. What's your contribution to knowledge? Or what's your concluding statement? What do you want the takeaway message to be? And there are very understandable reasons as to why we think through these sorts of ideas. We want there to be a really obvious sense of what we're trying to express and maybe what we hope the impact of our work is. But for me, everything is a dialogue. And again, to sort of draw on cultural studies and the work of scholars such as Stuart Hall, meanings aren't fixed, they're always in flux, they're always ongoing, and so are my thoughts. So as part of recent collaborative work, which has focused on being Black Oot Here and There in Scotland and Wales, and due to be shared as an online exhibition later this month, a group of 8 of us, which includes a collective, have been reflecting on the impact of Black people's presence. And digital technology has really contributed to what that's become. This is a process, again, that for me feels like a digital delight, and which mainly occurred, much like with the graphic novel and animation, in remote and asynchronous ways. And I'll also add, I'm hoping to hear a little bit more, or just a little bit, period, about what you feel a digital delight is. What does the idea of digital delights mean to you, and what are digital disturbances? So when it came to this project, Black Oot Here and There, in our words, as part of a statement that sort of prefaces the exhibition, while each sharing in our exhibition is unique, what maybe brings them all together is a sense of both pause and movement, in the same way that sea waves sometimes feel so still, yet also in motion. After all, being Oot Here and There is made up of many ongoing moments and memories, such as forms of peace and piecing together. Much like waves, we come and go, connecting and changing the environment imperceptibly, gradually but nonetheless leaving a place changed. Much like waves can be part of the rhythms of vast oceans, Black Oot Here and There is part of wider experiences and histories of Black life in Scotland and Wales. So in thinking about what I discussed today on the topic of Black digital currents, I kept coming back to waves, seas, ripples, and tides. The movements of not just water, but the movements of people, places, pasts, presents, and possibilities. Currents can be electrifying. I'm the sort of person who I can end up spending a lot of time just thinking through a word. So I felt as though before coming here today and sharing what I was going to share, I really wanted to sort of sit with, what do currents mean to me? What do I associate currents with? And certainly currents can be a form of flowing energy that quite literally brings light, or which can spark, shock, and jolt in ways that might feel helpful or might feel harmful and harassing. Contrastingly, currents can evoke the ebb and flow of bodies of water, weather, and the different ways that they shift and stay. So to me, currents are somehow both stormy and serene. Essentially, currents as a concept and a reality carry many different meanings and experiences. But what seems to connect them all is a sense of energy underlying currents, and what or who they put in motion. Depending on whose and what energy is at play, such currents can bring delight, disturbances, or both. And maybe a question that you might want to consider in your own time is, what sort of currents do you encounter when you experience digital spaces? What sort of energies are circulating, and who or what is that putting in motion, or who or what is that obstructing? In the context of digital currents, and by that I mean the movements and the direction of travel of online commentaries, content, communities, and contentions, we see that these currents are molded by a whole host of different factors. These include the affordances and power relations that are embedded in platforms, as well as the design of the platforms. So I think when we speak about platforms, it's important for us to not discuss them as though they exist independently from the ideas and intentions of people. Platforms are never neutral, and neither is the cultivation and monetization of forms of delight and disturbance online, some of which occurs as a result, you could say, of the callous clickbait attention economy that is really so central to social media, and increasingly is so central, unfortunately, to society at large. This means that when dealing with digital delights and disturbances, we're dealing with experiences that are not organic, so to speak. Rather, digital delights and disturbances are at least partly, if not predominantly, a byproduct of different sorts of power dynamics. These include the different connections and disconnections that exist between individual expressions of agency and structural factors. So thinking about what people choose to do, say, and create online as connecting to certain motivations, certain intentions, certain aspirations they have, but also acknowledging the fact that all of that is going to be impacted by different platforms, which can determine what people do share, how they do or share online, or how they can't. On that note, I want to share a little bit about a conversation I had with a friend a long time ago. So about a decade ago, a friend of mine who worked in advertising in the UK at that time, but has also worked across North America, this friend used to entertain me with stories about different people in the industry who were very clueless to the significance of Black Twitter. So we would have conversations, and my friend would, over the phone, and these were phone calls that were sort of filled with loose lips and laughter, my friend would regale me with vivid accounts of agencies obnoxiously dismissing the significance of Black Twitter, specifically what Black people, particularly in America, were doing and saying online, and the cultural force that was and is. In the years since then, we've seen a number of different organizations, a number of different brands really shift how they approach that and engage. So we've seen different organizations set up departments or create whole roles that are dedicated to focusing on attracting Black audiences, or are dedicated to focusing on aspects of Black digital culture. And during that time, alongside a shift in terms of recognition of what Black people do and say online on the part of various organizations, we've also seen this increasing interest in the notion of intersectionality. I'm not saying all of this in a celebratory way. I'm not saying this to sort of go, yay, isn't it great that brands are tapping into or checking in on what Black people are doing and saying online. It's more of an observation in terms of this sort of shift whereby consumer culture has, over the course in particular of the last 10 years or so, consumer culture has started to pay more attention to Black Twitter, has started to pay more attention to what is sometimes reframed as internet speak, Black vernaculars that circulate in digital spaces. I would caveat that by saying in recent weeks, recent months, the shifts we've seen to do with Twitter, now known as X, which I'll speak more about shortly, there certainly has been a reversal or a disruption and disturbance in terms of some of that sort of activity. So the shifts we saw several years ago, the creation of roles such as an employee to focus on intersectionality online, or an employee to focus on engaging with Black audiences in digital space, in the political context we're dealing with right now, we're seeing a lot of that changing. And although it can be quite flippant to use the expression DEI, diversity, inclusion, and or diversity, equality, and inclusion rollback or backlash, that's still an expression which captures some of what's going on. To bring this back to intersectionality and how it's been sort of taken up in the marketplace, whether it's in the form of influencer culture colliding with what social movements say online, or whether it's in the form of the pithy yet perfunctory press releases of brands, there are so many examples of when ideas to do with social justice and inequality are sort of incorporated into market logics. And in collaboration with Marcel Rosa Salas, I've looked at how intersectionality has been marketized and commodified. So we looked at hierarchies of knowledge to do with intersectionality, both in the marketplace, in forms of marketing, advertising, and branding, and also in marketing scholarship. So how is this idea sort of reframed, decontextualized, and recontextualized in scholarly contexts and industry contexts, and what are some of the overlaps and disconnects there? This meant that we were looking at how the idea of intersectionality, as it was originally conceptualized by Kimberly Crenshaw, rooted in a Black feminist and critical legal theorist position, has been sort of shifted and has become a vehicle to forms of profit making, depending on which individual or organization is trying to make use of that idea. And that work has involved us critically analysing how fundamentally intersectionality in the context of consumer culture becomes yet another market segmentation tool, another form of consumer profiling, a term that is used, or a lens that is used, to continue to profile individuals and target them, including through social media, in relation to their perceived intersecting identities and the sorts of oppression that they are or are not thought to be impacted by. Essentially, you could say that, much like with many other terms, intersectionality has been treated as a buzzword in the marketing space. As many other people have said long before me, and including as part of this great Digital Delights and Disturbances series, digital spaces are not only commercial conduits. So with the work that I do, I think and speak a lot about the marketplace, and I'm critical of the different ways that a market logic seeps into many elements of everyday life. But this isn't all just about money and commerce, although capitalism is ever present with all this. When we're dealing with digital delights and disturbances, we're also speaking about online sites and spaces of suppression and surveillance. So this includes the censorship and policing of people denouncing imperialism, colonialism, and calling for an end to genocides. Free Palestine, free Sudan, free Congo, and freedom to all oppressed people. When accounting for the extent to which digital communications are not only constrained, but also often ultimately controlled by corporations and governments, it feels important to bring other words into this conversation about digital delights and disturbances. And those words are dominance and defiance. Even if they might be experienced in profoundly personal ways, digital delights and disturbances, be they moments of comforting connection or the anguish of antagonisms, are contoured by structural expressions of domination. Undoubtedly, digital technologies and online communications are not accessible to all, a point that I'm sure I don't need to make, but a point that's always worth repeating. Indeed, distinct differences between people's material conditions and societal treatment at local, national, and international levels impact who can and cannot participate in various digital spaces, as well as impacting what is at stake when they can or cannot do so. In other words, not everyone has access to a stable internet connection and accompanying technologies that enable forms of self-expression, or participation as well. And even if they do, the treatment or mistreatment that they encounter in the process of expressing themselves can vary considerably. We know, or hopefully we all know, that there is no shortage of different forms of oppression that impact all of what's going on here. This includes the intersections of racism, sexism, misogyny, colorism, transphobia, Islamophobia, and many other different forms of structural power relations and inequality. Relatedly, pursuing digital peace, something that many people are in search of, and without contending with the realities of oppression and repression, from settler colonialism to imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, to turn to the work of Bell Hooks, pursuing those forms of digital peace without engaging with, acknowledging, or addressing all of that is simply an individualistic pursuit that sacrifices others in the process of a search for personal pleasures. And this is why, for me, it's helpful for us to distinguish between digital delights that might involve feelings of pleasure, feelings of enjoyment, but don't involve sacrificing others or denying or denouncing the realities of structural oppression, and those other times when the sorts of delight, the sorts of pleasure, the sorts of bliss that somebody's experiencing is ultimately rooted in a consumerist choice or an individualistic search for enjoyment for oneself. For these reasons and more, certain narratives about embracing digital disconnection, digital disengagement, and digital detoxing can often seem trivial at best, if not outright dismissive of distinct inequities and forms of discrimination, which mean that the choice to disconnect, disengage, or detox can be a luxury afforded to few with the means that enabled them to log on in the first place. I'm not dismissing times when people feel, I'm overloaded by dealing with the digital and I want to turn away from it in different ways. That's certainly something I've done and something that I continue to do. But I think we need to always be conscious of how we discuss those sorts of experiences in ways that don't overstate their potentially sort of emancipatory qualities, or don't conflate, again, sort of individual choices that are related to sort of consumerism, don't conflate that with liberationist organizing. Various framings of disconnecting, disengaging, and detoxing, so to speak, from digital culture, and specific sites at the center of it, can really gloss over what it means to willfully turn away from online spaces too. Particularly, what can happen is this glossing over of what it means to turn away from a space where oppressed people may still be defiantly disrupting and disturbing to bring attention to injustices, to build solidarity, and to try to challenge systemic oppressions. And none of what I'm speaking about is as simple as saying, log off, log out, delete this profile, delete this platform, or don't. It's messy. I guess what I'm really trying to get at is, how do we ensure that we move beyond discussing different ways of disconnecting and disengaging from the digital to move more towards thinking about the sort of material realities that people are dealing with. And if there's a certain digital space, as problematic as it might be, but it's a space where those who are most marginalized and oppressed are able to express what's going on and are trying to seek help and support from others, how can we ensure that in the process of potentially disengaging from that space, we don't disengage from those people and what they're doing and what they're saying? How can we ensure that we avoid a sort of insular digital experience where we're cocooned in a space that might feel comfortable to us, but really actually results in us disengaging from the harshness of life and the horrors that are part of it? Accordingly, emancipation from the overbearing impacts of social media and online platforms in general requires a lot more than a decision made by a single person. And it also requires a lot more than the sort of anti-social media stance of certain brands, some of whom benefit from positioning themselves as being critical of social media and big tech, but without doing anything of substance to push for significant or even small changes to big tech and sort of the state of the internet. And I'm saying this because some of the work that I've done has involved looking at the ways that brands sort of portray themselves as moving in silence, making these big declarative statements about how they're no longer using a certain social media site or they're logging off, but doing so in ways that ultimately boost their visibility online, and sometimes doing so in ways that might involve them going quiet on a particular platform, but still strategically engaging with influencers who use that platform, sort of calling into question the paradoxical nature of their position. Truly emancipatory actions must address the effects of systemic power regimes related to capitalism, global hierarchies, and much more, including to work to decentralize big tech's control, while additionally redirecting energies to spaces beyond hypervisible online ones. At times, the idea of delighting in something is associated with luxuriating in complete bliss, enjoyment, elation, and ecstasy. But daily moments of delight can be much more mundane than that, existing amid and even sitting alongside feelings of distress. Put differently, digital delights, as I understand them to be, can be fleeting and far from free of different and difficult feelings, such as the way that black joy still blooms amid times of black grief. This is because what truly makes for delight is not compartmentalizing and disconnecting by attempting to numb yourself or others from the realities of all that is happening. Rather, at the core of delight is a delicate dance between and with a multitude of emotions and sensations, embracing forms of pleasure without that being at the expense of engaging with the fuller picture of the world we inhabit. Put briefly, digital delights should not involve denial or dismissal, as I've said, of the horrors that other beings and the planet face. Words have meanings. They can express specific sentiments, describe the details of life, and powerfully invoke ideas about their histories. In the opening of Imagination, a Manifesto, Ruha Benjamin invites readers to reflect on the depth of the term imagination, and similar words such as imaginary and imagine. While reading Benjamin's resonant book, I thought a lot about the technology of imagination and imagination as technology. I won't speak more about this now, but I also spent some time looking at sort of the etymology of different notions of imagination and technology, and then getting sort of caught up in the very clear overlaps between different definitions of technology and imagination, and sort of grumbling to myself about the ways that we see science and the arts so often positioned as being in opposition with each other, when you look at how imagination and sort of technology have been conceived and described, the descriptions can be incredibly similar. So a conversation for another day about art as science and science as art. But to bring it back to imagination and to draw on the words of Benjamin, imagination by definition takes many different forms. And in Benjamin's words, I refuse to police the parameters of imagination. Similarly, technology, for better or worse, I feel is expansive and entwined with imaginations. The creative and open-ended ways that people conjure up ideas, that is, imagination, can be central to creating and sharing knowledge, and to creating and contributing to physical infrastructures, as well as strengthening social values, cultural memory, and communal relations. Imagination, including the incantations of dreaming and collective work towards a different, not simply reformed world, can be at the heart of Black feminism, although I also recognize that there are many different approaches to Black feminism, so we can speak of Black feminisms here. The digital experiences of Black feminists, which are scaffolded by a wide range of platforms, sites, and devices, certainly do not start and end with Twitter, now known as X. For decades, Black feminists have incorporated digital tools and technology into ways of communicating and working together, be it through blogging, contributing to online forums and discussion boards, sharing audio and video files, or crafting and circulating email campaigns. While the turbulence introduced by Musk's acquisition of Twitter has catalyzed public discussions and debates about the problems and possibilities of social media and the internet, the digital homemaking practices of Black feminists, as I refer to them here, have never been defined by a particular platform or digital trend of the time. Instead, the digital homemaking approaches of Black feminists have always involved both reimagining and recreating spaces in ways that defy the market logic, and in ways that often involve existing within spaces that were certainly never designed by or for Black feminists. Particularly here, thinking about the work of Bell Hooks again, and the brilliant work of Azizat Johnson, previously I've written about what I refer to as the digital nesting of Black feminism. My invocation of notions of nesting is intended to articulate the careful creation of many ephemeral spaces into which Black feminists as individuals, Black feminist ideas, interactions, and intentions settle for some time. And I really want to emphasize some time, because when we're dealing with the digital, and when we're dealing with everything really, nothing is permanent, although you could say some things are still forever. So digital nesting involves settling in these different spaces for some time without ever solely being rooted there. Much like the ingenious ways that birds make and remake nests from the assortment of materials available to them in their environment, Black feminist digital nesting practices involve repurposing digital tools and repurposing digital spaces, providing forms of shelter, comfort, and intimacy that are experienced from and across many different physical and domestic spaces. The idea of a digital nest, I'm aware it might feel abstract, but it's something that I would say is made up of much more than the sum of any digital or tangible parts. Such abstraction reflects the fact that digital nests cannot simply be seen or firmly grasped. While remnants of them may linger in the form of both active and inactive Black feminist websites, hashtags, social media spaces, and group discussions, digital nests are never simply the case of dealing with one online location, one person, one collective. Instead, they're continually remade in layered ways that are, to draw on the words of Gail Lewis, always already. And here I'm thinking about the fact they're always already both online and offline, much like Digital Delights and Disturbances are always connected to the real world, sort of discarding this binary of virtual world and IRL. All of this is dealing with the real. As such, the digital nesting of Black feminism is reflective of, again, to bring in the work of Gail Lewis, non-linear temporalities. And this means affirming asynchronous and multimodal forms of communicating, audio notes, blogging, digital collaging, as both Katusha Bento and Azizat Johnson have looked at in relation to a brilliant piece on Black gems and thinking about the importance of audio notes and different rhythms and forms of time. What we're dealing with here is about much more than a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what we're dealing with here is about much more than simply a single moment. I think it's very common for us to see with public and political discussions issues being referred to as a time, a trend, a hashtag, a moment. But all of what's happening in the present is connected to the past and the future, and sort of sitting with all of that in a way that doesn't treat things as neat and boxed off is central to contending with the sorts of issues to do with inequality that we're talking about today. All that's to say that digital nests and digital nesting are terms that may go some way towards expressing elements of the digital homemaking practices of Black feminists, which involve navigating various geographies, platforms, and devices across different time zones and ways of processing and parsing information. And on that note, I also want to reflect on the brilliant work of Moya Bailey on different issues to do with the intersections of sexism, misogyny, and anti-Blackness, misogynoir, but also ableism. So thinking about Black feminist approaches to disability justice and what it means to ensure that when we speak about communicating, when we speak about digital experiences, we recognize how people's experiences can vary in so many different ways, including to do with issues related to access. While they can be crucial to experiences of it, technology is about much more than just instrumentalist mechanics, engineering, tools, and systems. Technology and Black women's harnessing of it includes fluid forms of creativity. So for me, the work of a cultural critic is technology, it's imagination. And that means that here I really want to sort of stress the importance of the arts, the collective creations and impacts of Black women's arts movements, poetic insights, protests, archives. Whether it's in online spaces or offline environments, knowledge of how to tend to yourselves and rupture surveillance forces is shared far and wide between Black women, including through artworks, oral histories, archives, and utterances rarely deemed technology in British society and elsewhere, but nonetheless technological from my point of view. And speaking of technology, I'm conscious I haven't moved the slides on, although there's not much there, but I'll do that right now. So this means that for me, it's really vital that we learn a lot more about the histories of Black women, Black feminists in Britain, and of course beyond too, including social, political, and creative movements and practices. By doing so, we can then embrace and critique ideas about technology without overlooking the many different and collective imaginations that shape it today. And by doing so, we can hopefully avoid certain reductive discussions of digital culture that really center on or foreground the experiences of those who are least impacted by oppression. There are so many different examples I could give of this, including anecdotes, but oftentimes we'll see people speak about social media platforms, the challenges and problems related to it in a way that doesn't involve them sort of thinking critically about the fact that a space that might feel open and welcoming to them is certainly not a space that is open and welcoming to others. And amongst many other things, engaging the work of Black feminists can help to address that in a much more meaningful and informed way. So earlier on, I spoke a bit about Black Oot Here and There, a collaboration that focuses on the experiences and reflections of some Black people in and from Scotland and Wales, while acknowledging the connectedness of experiences and histories elsewhere, such as internationalist solidarities and struggles for freedom around the world. I want to move towards the end of my sharing by returning to thinking a bit about Black Oot Here and There. In the opening statement that features as part of our forthcoming online exhibition, we affirm that, as was apparent from the start of this journey, there are many places and cultures, including beyond Scotland and Wales, that are part of who each of us is, and which are woven throughout what was created for our exhibition. With that in mind, the exhibition includes some translations that reflect people's decision to share in different languages that resonate with them and what they created. We had a conversation and a conscious decision was made that not everything needs to be translated into a certain language. And actually some things are going to be expressed, whether orally or in writing, in one language, but not in any others. And if there are some people who aren't able to understand what's being expressed, that's part of the way the exhibition is experienced. And that's also part of how people might think through what it can mean to be a Black person from particular places in Scotland, in Wales, in different contexts. whereby you might be expressing yourself and sharing about who you are and what you're experiencing, but other people might act as though something's lost in translation or that what's being shared is not legible. So as part of this exhibition, we also really spent some time sort of sitting with ideas to do with dreaming, storytelling, otherworldliness, intimacy, family, love, remembering, holding, releasing, and more. But our approach to this has not meant focusing on a specific theme, question, topic, or provocation. Although, as I said earlier on, to me, this experience, it resembles what might feel as though is a digital delight. I also think that it's really essential for me to emphasize that when doing this sort of work, there are also many times when the realities of how disturbing it can be to be a Black person out here and there. There are also many times when you're faced with the sort of tension of moments of delight, moments of joy, moments of connection, but which sometimes still involve having to think through and share about the sort of shared struggles and experiences that are almost inevitable when being out here and there in these places. And throughout the process of gathering online and communicating and creating in various ways, we've tried to embrace an openness. That's a word that I really love. Openness is something that I think we're seeing less and less of. I always hold on to hope, so I definitely am far from hopeless, and I think that sort of dwelling in despair, much like disconnecting and disengaging and detoxing online, can be a luxury, so that's not what I'm doing here. But I do think that openness is so important for so many reasons, and maybe people want to think a little bit about the relationship between openness and digital delights, and also the relationship between openness and digital disturbances. So we embraced a sense of openness when doing this, and also the spirit of cwtch, a Welsh word for a warming hug and sense of support, as we curried into, a Scots term for nestling into, the space for expressing whatever each person or collective is drawn to expressing, and in a way that they wanted to express it. And as I said a few moments ago, that means sort of sitting with mess, and it means sharing in ways that some people might find confusing, but that's the nature of life. And actually, I often feel the worst thing we can do, whether it's as writers, researchers, creatives, or artists, is portray things as much more neat and tidy and clear-cut or clean-cut than they are. While all that made Black Oot Here and There possible involved much more than just digital technology, there's no doubt that it aided how we came together and we created together, in, across, and beyond Scotland and Wales, and in, across, and beyond different and shared experiences. With that and so much more in mind, and aligned with how this series deals with the thorny entanglements of what digital technology enables and obstructs, I'll close by saying that within and beyond digital delights and disturbances are different dreams, desires, and demands. Imagination, intention, and action. But not all dreams, desires, and demands are made at home in digital spaces, and dreams, desires, and demands aren't inherently good. It would be misguided to portray social media and digital culture as an autonomous, imposing force that solely affects people rather than being affected by them. Not to suggest that social media is, how should we put it, less impactful than it really is. Ultimately, such online activity both influences and is influenced by dreams, desires, and demands, those of some people anyway. And this includes those of individuals who own certain online sites, platforms, apps, and digital corporations, enabling them to determine the way that social media functions and who and which political positions are especially platformed. No matter how much the space for delight and dissenting disruption on social media narrows, not to suggest that such space has ever been a given, it's been hard fought for, and not to suggest that such space has ever been spacious. No matter all of that, the currents of consciousness-raising, liberationist work, and solidarity building find a way. Regardless, we still live in a world where in many situations, access to digital technology and the internet can be a matter of life or death. So we must continue to work to tackle the pervasive power regimes that position oppressed people as simply disturbing and disturbed, whether online or offline, and which render delights as little more than digital consumerism or self-soothing and self-serving, and often involving the disregard of others. Thank you very much for your time. And as I said before, in all of this, no matter how challenging or critical what we're dealing with is, there's always space for hope and openness to bloom and blossom. And I just really appreciate the opportunity to think about digital delights and disturbances with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for this rich overview of your work, of your current work, and also for posing important questions. And I'm sure there are a number of questions that our students, colleagues might have. Perhaps we all need just a few moments just
I was going to say, people can take their time. Yeah.
Yes, to think through all these issues that Francesca raised. Of course, you're welcome to raise your hand if you already have comments, questions, feedback, reactions to Francesca's talk.
And there's no rush, because time's not linear. So,
anyone? So I'm gonna go do double duty tonight and run around.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated your talk. And
thanks.
I'm just asking for some advice, because I'm quitting Twitter. And I'm wondering if there's a discussion going on at Black Twitter about where to go.
So I just feel like there are so many discussions around Twitter as a starting point. And I think, for context, I'm still on it for now, right? Conflicted for sure, for lots of different reasons. And I guess I wouldn't want to position myself as an authority on any of the discussions going on, but I suppose some of my thoughts on the matter and why I'm conflicted are as follows. So I agree with all the, I don't even want to say critiques, just like the recognition of what that platform has become, who is behind it, what it facilitates. But I also am concerned that there can be a focus on that platform in a way that takes away from the reality that those same issues exist across not just many different digital platforms, but many different spaces that we're all implicated in. And I suppose, whilst I can completely understand why people are choosing to leave it, I also feel as though sometimes the decision to leave is framed as possibly having more of an impact than it might, or is framed as inevitably involving somebody moving to an alternative that does not contribute to or replicate the sorts of forms of oppression that Twitter so clearly does. I would also say, I think, a really key point that people have been making, which I agree with, is that space has been a harmful space for so many marginalized folks from the get-go, right? So there are many people saying now people take issue with it, not many years ago when, Black feminists, trans people, people impacted by Islamophobia were talking about how they were suppressed online. We're talking about coordinated forms of online abuse. There's sort of a conversation around, now those who aren't used to dealing with the sorts of issues that we are seeing them for what they are. Now is when people want to leave. And I think that's part of the challenge in terms of what is the significance of leaving in this moment without replicating this sort of moment and trend and time idea. But in terms of where people are going, I'm seeing a lot of people going to Blue Sky. I created a profile there a while ago and I haven't been able to sort of fully engage with it because I think I've not really sort of made peace with all that's going on. And I also feel strongly about sometimes staying in the mess, but navigating it in a different way. And that's something that, again, I think marginalized people have done online throughout. So whether that is keeping a profile so you can see what's going on, but not sharing in as visible ways. And also being real about the fact that some of the places people are moving to, there's a lot of discussion around sort of the respectability politics there. So I know with Blue Sky, no shade to Blue Sky, many people are saying, although it feels a lot better in terms of, let's say, affordances to address harassment and sort of just the cultivation of a more of a space of openness, there are also people saying that it feels as though it's quite a staid or stifling space, and it maybe feels a little bit more formal, and then you sort of think, if respectability politics enters into those spaces, again, what's that going to mean for marginalised people, and are we going to see the replication of structural whiteness, and it might not take the form of far-right rhetoric, but it might still involve the sort of exclusion of, let's say, black folks and people of colour. So lots of different thoughts there, and I think I might end up logging out for good at some point, but not yet. And if people do log out, I also think they need to reflect on what might they be not engaging with that's still there, and is some of what's still there coming from people who are dealing with forms of oppression in different parts of the world, and who we should be engaging with and supporting. And if you're not accessing that through Twitter, fair enough, but are you still engaging with that? And if so, in what ways? Definitely don't go to LinkedIn, that's what I'd say to anybody. That's somewhere I've never engaged with and won't to this day.
Thank you. Francesca, are there other questions, comments, reactions? Someone who would like to share also their experiences of also inhabiting hostile digital environments, or just follow up to these conversations?
Or also, because I like throwing questions out, if people don't have things they want to ask me, I was wondering what people's thoughts are on digital delights and disturbances. So I just love knowing the different ways that people attach meanings to terms, or what you're thinking of when you think of digital delights and disturbances. Because I guess disturbances, again, they don't have to be inherently bad or negative. You know, disturbance and disruption can be generative, but what does all of this mean to you? I'm trying to turn it into a seminar now.
So I had a question about the topic of openness, and I just wanted to know your thoughts on, do you think it's inherently dangerous to be fully open on social media, like especially on Elon Musk's Twitter? You see how much hate's being thrown around and how normalized it's become, with the owner of the website kind of being the driving force behind that. So how important do you value openness on a social media site like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess when I was talking about openness, it was less about social media and digital culture specifically, and more about how people connect and are in relation to each other. So very brief answer to the first part, no, I definitely wouldn't advise people to be fully open in that sort of space. And I don't think that even if somebody wanted to, it would be possible because of how it's set up and how algorithms function and all these different constraining factors. I'd also say that, yeah, I guess on the topic of openness more generally, for me, part of what can support that is, and I know this is maybe contradictory in some ways to some of what I was saying earlier on, but it's not a disengaging, but and it's not even a turning away from, but it's ensuring that there are times when people are physically connecting with others, or are having conversations in non-public ways. That's what I'll say. I think when we speak about social media and digital culture, we tend to focus so much on what is public, what is visible, what's hyper-visible. But digital technology and different platforms can be used as part of sort of like the infrastructure or relationship building for collective organizing in ways that doesn't involve pushing out content for others to see, but instead involves trying to have conversations with each other that feel sort of deep, meaningful, and open. And that can mean dealing with conflict and sort of conflict resolution and accountability mechanisms. And I think that that's where openness can sort of open. But yeah, to bring it back to the first part of your question, I definitely wouldn't say, not just Twitter, I would say a lot of social media sites don't lend themselves to openness in a meaningful way. And especially given in recent years some of the shifts that have occurred. So social media sites that once didn't have a sort of marketplace built in, whereby a profile can very quickly be turned into a shop, or times when a site was maybe, you know, there was more of an emphasis on shorthand forms of communicating rather than self-branding and creating a digital presence. I don't want to write off social media because I think it's unhelpful when people just sort of feed into moral panic and say that it can't be part of how people connect with each other. But openness is so much more than that. And because of how people are monitored online, I think that, again, increasingly the last thing many people want to do, understandably, is be open there. So we need to find other ways to do that.
Any other thoughts or questions? Perhaps while people keep thinking about that, I do have a question. And while you were talking, I would like to connect to different parts of your talk. So you were mentioning the way in which intersectionality has become this buzzword that has been taken up by also marketing agencies and technologies that use the perceived intersectional identities of potential customers and use intersectionality as a way to advance their purposes. And I would like to connect that to your reflections on Black feminists and the nesting practices of Black feminism, and wonder whether you would consider nesting, Black feminist nesting, as a way to reclaim and take care of intersectionality.
So I think there are lots of different perspectives in relation to intersectionality, including very valuable critiques of some of the ways it's applied. So, there are discussions about the fact that its origins sort of connect to legal systems and actually is focusing on legal systems and what's legible within them the best place to begin with when we're trying to approach things in maybe sort of more a liberationist oriented way. So I guess what I would say is I think about Black feminist digital nesting practices as being less about sort of reclaiming intersectionality and more about how to reclaim time and space for Black feminists, or not even just reclaim, but how to create a sense of connectedness and a sense of belonging in contexts that are often very difficult to exist within. So it's maybe more of a reclaiming of sort of a reclaiming of the fullness of who Black feminists are, and in the absence, for example, of being able to be fully open on Twitter, how might Black feminists piece together or make use of different digital spaces and platforms to connect with each other, to sometimes communicate in ways that involve expressing something to each other, whilst also ensuring that what's being expressed isn't visible to people beyond that. And that's not just the case of, let's say, having a private profile. That might be thinking about the playful use of terms, the playful use of visuals, how to make use of signifying practices, and yeah, it's maybe less about reclaiming intersectionality, but certainly it's about how to acknowledge the interconnected nature of oppression that impacts Black feminists, but then to think, well, how can we try and create some form of comfort and connection and maybe even sort of ease within very uneasy and uncomfortable and often disconnected and atomized online spaces.
So you mentioned the co-opting of Black language by the general culture and then even brands on Twitter. And I think as a reaction to that, there's been a lot of movements to try to get that sort of language under a banner and say who can use it, who can't. And at least what I've seen, that banner is very often AAVE or African American vernacular English. Do you think trying to get that sort of aspects of Black culture under one specific banner narrows the scope of what that identity can be?
So what I would say is, I guess I've seen less of that sort of approach and more people rightly saying, sort of like know your history, right? So there was an agency, I think it was like a creative and marketing agency a few years ago. I mean, there's lots of these examples, right? And they did a piece about internet speak, or it'll be sort of, you know, Gen Z or Gen Z speak, all these different terms. And often it's language that not only stems from Black vernaculars, but also the vernaculars of LGBTQ folks, sort of drawing on terms that have had huge meaning and significance in these different communities for so long, and just completely decontextualizing them. So I'd say I've seen less of people saying that this term has to be sort of understood as existing under a banner, and more people saying, be specific, right? We can acknowledge that certain generations are maybe using these terms more than others, and particularly online, that's completely fine to do. But we need to think about the origins of these terms and the different meanings they've taken on at different points in time. And that doesn't mean dismissing the fact that some people are maybe engaging with terms that they weren't previously, but we also need to think critically about power in relation to all this, and why is it that when certain groups, let's say, start to use a term, suddenly it's popular or normalized or it's acceptable, whereas when others were using that term, it was pejorative or it was dismissed or it was mocked.
Yes, you're quite far. I'm going to try to get there.
So, taking in consideration the outcome of the recent elections in the United States, do you think the situation will change or will be affected? And if it will, how do you think it will?
That's a huge question. I'm like, I've got so many questions in response, like, change what? Who's affected? I mean, I just think everything is going to change, and also a lot won't. But yeah, I think I'm still, first of all, I'm conscious that I wouldn't want to sort of overindulge my own thoughts on this as somebody who lives in the UK and as someone who is, you know, not nearly as familiar with American politics as people in America. But, you know, the outcome of the election is significant for lots of different reasons. But I'll also add, I'm thinking about something I read today, whereby someone was, this sort of connects to points we've been discussing, somebody was saying, and this relates to British politics too, okay, 'cause, you know, we've had so many different changes in recent years and it's wild, but someone today was saying, oftentimes after a political election, there will be concerns about certain forms of inequality and oppression, and these are legitimate concerns, nobody's dismissing them, but much like sort of the conversation around Twitter and people suddenly being like, Twitter's a bad place, and it's like, well, where have you been? Like, Twitter's been a mess for a minute. And this person was saying, no matter the outcome of this election, the sorts of forms of oppression and inequality that people are concerned about have been entrenched for so long, and they didn't disappear when someone else was in power politically. And they weren't making light of the significance of the outcome of the election. I guess they were saying, how can we not disregard the fact that no matter who's been in power, you know, anti-immigrant rhetoric or Islamophobic actions or racist and misogynistic legislation has existed and has continued to go through. How can we acknowledge that whilst also, of course, deal with the enormity of what this means? So, yeah, it's maybe not a very neat response, but some of the changes I think we will see certainly relates to the digital and mass movements from certain platforms to others. My concern still is that people might view any platform as being safe when the sorts of forms of surveillance and suppression that I was speaking about exist in all sorts of different digital spaces. So although, you know, I do a lot of work dealing with the politics of digital culture, although it's important for us to acknowledge the politics of Twitter, the politics of X, I don't want us to then start to speak about any other space as though it's beyond the reach and impact of, let's say, right-wing, far-right, fascist ideologies and approaches. And also when we're dealing with governments and political institutions, they're never going to be the ones to save oppressed people. Not to say that meaningful action can't come as a result of them, but if we look back throughout history, the issues we're dealing with today aren't new, and that's a sad reality. But that's also why beyond just engaging with democratic processes and sort of institutionalized forms of political action. We need to turn our attention to sort of communities and collective organising and mutual aid and grassroots ways of working together, and that sense of openness and being in relation to each other, which doesn't mean being solely dependent on any political figure or political body.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Perhaps a last question for Francesca?
And if not, that's all right, because it's been a heavy, I don't want to say it's been heavy
Yes.
last week. We're in November, and I can't believe we're already in November, and there's a lot going on. So I guess I just want to take this opportunity to, again, say thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to you all for being here today, and for making the time and for what you've asked and shared about. And if anybody wants to continue the conversation after or over an email or online, probably not on Twitter, X, then I'm happy to.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and thank you, everyone. So just a quick reminder that the next two dates for DDD are November 21st and November 25. In November 21st, we're going to have a performance artist from Lebanon, and on November 25th, we're going to have Tiziana Terranova, a scholar of digital media from L'Orientale in Naples. Thank you, everyone, for coming.